Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The house looked different that evening. It felt different. My sister Vanessa and I had spent the day in town, escaping the oppressive heat and boredom of our isolated corner of the world. By the time we returned, the sun had dipped below the treetops, and long shadows stretched like fingers, wrapping the old house in a shroud of darkness. Something about the stillness made me hesitate as I reached for the door handle. "Do you think Mom's okay?" Vanessa whispered, staring at the darkened house. The lights were off, even though Mom should have been home for hours. "Of course," I replied. But even I didn't believe my words. I pushed the door open, and a blast of cold air hit me, raising goosebumps along my arms. Inside, it was dark, too dark. The kind of dark that makes you second-guess every step, that makes your eyes play tricks on you as they struggle to adjust. I flipped the switch, but nothing happened. The power was out. The air felt heavy, as if the house itself was holding something back, concealing secrets in every corner. A faint smell lingered, something metallic and wrong that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the usual mustiness of our old farmhouse. This was different, newer, more disturbing. "Mom?" I called, my voice swallowed by the silence. Vanessa stayed close, her phone light cutting through the darkness. The beam swept over picture frames and furniture, which seemed oddly out of place, as if they had shifted while we were gone. The coffee table was pushed several feet from its usual spot. A chair lay on its side. The throw rug was bunched up against the wall, as if something had been dragged across the floor. "Mom, are you here?" Vanessa called, louder this time, her voice cracking with worry. Still nothing. The silence was deafening, pressing against my eardrums until I could hear my own pulse thundering in my head. The hairs on my neck stood on end, a primal warning that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. I moved deeper into the house, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. Each creak seemed amplified in the quiet, announcing our presence to whatever might be waiting in the shadows. Vanessa's phone light bounced erratically as her hands trembled, casting bizarre shadows that danced across the walls like grotesque puppets. The living room was in disarray. Books had been swept from the shelves, their pages scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. The curtains hung at odd angles, one rod completely torn from the wall. Deep scratches marred the paint on the doorframe leading to the kitchen, long parallel gouges that looked like they'd been made by something with claws. "What happened here?" Vanessa breathed, her voice barely a whisper. I had no answer. My mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. A break-in, an animal somehow getting inside, but none of those explanations felt right. The damage was too specific, too deliberate. And where was Mom? Then we heard it, a voice, distant and muffled, coming from outside. "Is that?" Vanessa turned toward the back door, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. It was Mom, or at least it sounded like her. But something was wrong. The words were garbled, as if she was speaking underwater, or as if her mouth was full of something. The rhythm was off too slow, with strange pauses between syllables that no human voice should have. Without thinking, we moved toward the sound, drawn by the desperate need to find her, to know she was safe. I pushed open the back door and stepped into the night. The woods loomed before us, a black wall of trees swallowing the last of the daylight. Mom's voice drifted through the branches, a strange sing-song quality to it now, like she was calling us deeper into the darkness. I hesitated at the edge of the trees, my hand gripping the door frame so hard my knuckles turned white. Dad had always warned us about the deep woods, about getting lost out there, especially at night. The forest behind our house was dense, sprawling for miles in every direction. People had disappeared in those woods before, hunters who'd wandered too far, hikers who'd strayed from marked trails. Some were found days later, confused and dehydrated. Others were never found at all. But this was Mom. She needed us. Vanessa didn't wait. She switched on her phone light and stepped forward, her feet crunching on dead leaves. I followed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back. to call for help, to do anything but follow that voice into the darkness. The deeper we went, the stranger it became. The air grew colder with each step. Despite the summer heat we'd left behind, the trees twisted in unnatural ways, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers reaching for something they could never grasp. The shadows shifted constantly, playing tricks on my peripheral vision. I could have sworn I saw shapes darting between the trunks, just beyond the reach of our light, tall, impossibly thin figures that vanished when I tried to look directly at them. "Mom," I called, my voice cracking. The sound was swallowed by the darkness, absorbed by the thick canopy above us. No echo returned. It was as if the forest had consumed my voice entirely. The ground beneath our feet became uneven, covered with roots that seemed to reach up and grab at our ankles. Vanessa stumbled and I caught her arm, steadying her. Her phone light wavered and for a moment we were plunged into complete darkness. The battery was dying. "We need to go back," I said, finally finding my voice. "This isn't right. We need to call the police." But Vanessa shook her head, her jaw set with determination. "We can't leave her out here." Then we heard it, a scream, high-pitched, terrified, unmistakably Mom's. It echoed through the woods, bouncing off the trees until I couldn't tell where it had come from. The sound cut through me like a knife. Pure terror and agony rolled into one horrible wail. "We have to go," Vanessa said, but now panic had replaced her earlier determination. She started running, her flashlight bouncing wildly, creating a disorienting strobe effect that made the trees seem to move. I ran after her, branches whipping against my face, leaving stinging cuts across my cheeks. The ground uneven beneath my feet threatened to send me sprawling with every step. The woods seemed to close in around us, the trees growing thicker, their trunks like bars in a cage designed specifically to trap us. My lungs burned as I gasped for air. The cold had intensified, turning each breath into a painful reminder of how deep into the woods we'd gone. Ice crystals formed on the trees despite the summer season, glittering in the dying light of Vanessa's phone. Frost crunched beneath our feet, where there should have been only dry leaves and dirt. Then we saw it. A clearing opened up ahead, and there in the center stood something that defied all logic, all understanding of the natural world. It was tall, at least 8 feet, its body a twisted amalgamation of wrong proportions and impossible angles. The thing's head was vaguely skull-like, but elongated and warped, as if someone had stretched human bone like clay. Strips of what might have been flesh hung in ragged ribbons from its frame, exposing yellowed bone beneath. The eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with an unnatural red light that seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence. They fixed on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl, as if they could see not just our bodies but something deeper, something essential about who we were. The sockets were too large, too deep, boring into us like physical weight. The body was a grotesque mix of bones and rotting tissue. Its limbs twisted at angles that shouldn't exist. Arms bent backward at the elbows. Legs jointed in 3 places instead of 2. Fingers too many fingers. Extended from hands that were more claw than human appendage. The whole thing moved with a jerking, spasmodic motion, as if it was fighting against its own form with every movement. And the smell. God, the smell. It was death and decay, rot and corruption, so thick I could taste it coating the back of my throat. The stench of meat left too long in summer heat, of things that should be buried but aren't, of biological processes gone horribly irreversibly wrong. My stomach heaved, and I fought down the urge to vomit. The creature turned its head toward us with a grinding sound, like bones scraping against each other. The empty sockets locked onto mine, and I felt my entire body freeze. It grinned, an expression so wrong on that face that my mind struggled to process it. Yellow fangs, too sharp and too numerous, glinted in the faint light as its mouth stretched impossibly wide. It took a step forward, and reality seemed to shimmer around it. The body shifted, dissolving into shadow, becoming less solid with each movement. The red eyes remained, floating in the darkness like burning coals. The grin grew wider, more sinister, stretching beyond where any mouth should end. "Run," I screamed, grabbing Vanessa's arm. We turned and ran. The world blurred around us, becoming a nightmare landscape of grasping branches and hidden obstacles. Every tree looked the same. Every direction seemed both right and wrong simultaneously. Branches tore at our clothes, leaving scratches that burned. Roots grabbed at our feet like fingers reaching up from graves. Behind us, I could hear it, the heavy thud of footsteps that sounded wrong, too many impacts for two legs, keeping pace with us no matter how fast we ran. The rustling of leaves was everywhere, surrounding us, echoing from all directions at once. That low guttural growl seemed to echo inside my head, bypassing my ears entirely to resonate in my skull. The deep woods were alive, whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand but that filled me with existential dread. And I knew without a doubt that we weren't supposed to be there, that we had violated some fundamental rule simply by entering this place. My lungs screamed for air. My legs felt like lead, each step requiring more effort than the last. Vanessa stumbled, and I hauled her up, practically dragging her forward. We couldn't stop. Stopping meant death, or worse. Something told me there were fates worse than death waiting in those woods. The lights of the house came into view, flickering through the trees like a beacon. I pushed myself harder, finding reserves of energy I didn't know I had. My legs ached, my chest burned, sweat poured down my face despite the unnatural cold. We stumbled out of the woods onto the back lawn, and I slammed the door shut behind us with enough force to rattle the frame. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. For a moment, there was silence. Just the sound of our ragged breathing, the pounding of my heart threatening to break free from my chest. But as I looked at Vanessa, saw the terror etched into every line of her face, I knew this wasn't over. Whatever was out there, whatever had lured us into the deep woods with our mother's voice, it wasn't done with us yet, not by a long shot. The door was shut behind us, but the cold grip of fear still clung to my skin like a second layer. Vanessa and I stood in the darkness of our kitchen, panting, trying to catch our breath. My fingers trembled against the wooden frame, and I could barely make out Vanessa's wide-eyed expression in the dim light filtering through the window. The house was dark, and it wasn't just because the lights were off. It felt darker, as if the shadows themselves had substance, had weight, had intention. They seemed to pulse and writhe in the corners of my vision, never quite still when I tried to look directly at them. "Is it gone?" Vanessa whispered, her voice barely audible over our heavy breathing. She took a shaky step closer to me, her phone light flickering across the room. The battery was almost dead, the light growing dimmer with each passing second. Soon we'd be in complete darkness. "I don't know." I tried to keep my voice steady, but the words wavered despite my best efforts. I glanced around, my eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness. The flashlight cast long, twisting shadows that seemed to move independently, creating the illusion of movement where there should be none. The air was too still, too cold for a summer night. Something was wrong. More than just the power being out, more than the thing that had chased us. It was like the house itself had changed while we were gone, had been infected by whatever evil lurked in those woods. We moved cautiously, my hand reaching for the countertop as I tried to find some semblance of balance. My legs were still shaking from our run, my muscles trembling with exhaustion and fear. Then we noticed the tracks, dark muddy prints smeared across the floor, creating a trail that told a story I didn't want to read. My stomach twisted into a knot, dread pooling in my gut like ice water. They weren't human footprints. They were large, easily twice the size of my own feet, with what looked like claw marks at the end of each toe. The prints were deep, pressed into the linoleum with enough force to leave permanent indentations. Whatever had made them was heavy, substantial, terrifyingly real. The tracks led from the front door to the kitchen, creating a deliberate path through our home. They didn't waver or hesitate. They moved with purpose, as if whatever made them knew exactly where it was going. The prints faded away as they neared the back hallway, not because the thing had left, but because the mud had worn off its feet as it walked. Vanessa and I exchanged a glance. I could see the fear in her eyes, saw my own terror reflected back at me. "What do we do?" Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling so badly I almost couldn't make out the words. My mind raced, but I didn't have an answer. Part of me wanted to run back outside, to get in the car and drive until we ran out of gas. But another part, the part that had been raised in this house, that knew every creak and corner, couldn't leave. Not without knowing what had happened to Mom. Not without at least trying to understand. "Let's just see if Mom's here," I said, though my gut told me that wasn't what we were going to find. Something had changed in her voice when it had called to us from the woods. Something fundamental and wrong that made my skin crawl just remembering it. We moved slowly, the light from Vanessa's phone bobbing and casting flickering shadows across the walls. The batteries were failing faster now, the light growing dimmer with each passing second. Soon we'd be navigating by touch alone, blind in our own home. The scraping sound came first, a rhythmic dragging sound that made my skin crawl and my teeth clench. It was coming from the kitchen, just ahead of us. The sound was methodical, repetitive, but with occasional stops and stutters that made it seem almost mechanical. My throat tightened, and I felt Vanessa's hand grip my arm, her nails digging in hard enough to leave marks. We inched forward, every muscle in my body tensed and ready to run. The sight that met us in the dim glow of the flashlight made my breath catch in my throat, made my mind struggle to process what my eyes were seeing. Mom was there, standing at the center of the kitchen, her back to us. She was pushing a mop back and forth across the floor, but the motion was wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. It was jerky, like a puppet on strings, like someone who'd forgotten how humans move and was trying to remember from a poorly written instruction manual. The mop scraped uselessly against the already clean floor, accomplishing nothing, serving no purpose except to continue the motion. Her head hung at an odd angle, tilted too far to one side as if her neck had been broken. Her shoulders were hunched in a way that made her spine curve unnaturally. Her whole body trembled slightly with each movement, small spasms running through her frame that had nothing to do with exertion. She was humming something, a tune I didn't recognize, in a pitch that was just slightly off from any note a human should be able to produce. The sound grated against my ears, making my molars ache. "Mom?" I managed, my voice cracking and barely above a whisper. She paused. The mop stopped mid-scrape, held suspended in the air. Her head lifted slightly, but she didn't turn around. The air grew colder, so cold I could see my breath misting in front of me. A chill settled into my bones that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the wrongness radiating from the figure in front of us. Slowly, so slowly it seemed to take an eternity, she turned her head. Her neck twisted unnaturally, rotating far beyond what human anatomy should allow. The bones in her neck made small cracking sounds with each degree of rotation, until her face was halfway toward us, her body still facing away. The angle was impossible, the position something that should have left her paralyzed or dead. Her eyes, once warm and full of life, the eyes that had comforted me through nightmares and celebrated my victories, were now hollow, dark, like two empty pits drilled into her skull. They didn't reflect light the way living eyes should. They absorbed it, pulling it in like twin black holes. There was nothing behind them, no recognition, no consciousness, just void. Her mouth stretched into a smile that didn't reach those dead eyes. Her lips pulled back to reveal crooked yellow teeth, stained and wrong. The smile was too wide, stretching the skin of her face taut until I thought it might tear. It was the smile of something that had seen humans smile and was trying to imitate the expression without understanding its meaning. "Your father," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion, completely monotone. "He's gone." The words hung in the air, a statement with no explanation, no feeling, delivered with the same inflection someone might use to comment on the weather. The voice came from Mom's mouth, but it wasn't her voice. It was too deep, with strange harmonics that sounded like multiple voices speaking in unison. Vanessa whimpered beside me, and I could feel her starting to shake, her whole body trembling against mine. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, my throat so tight I could barely force the words out. Mom's head turned a little more, her neck crackling and popping with the movement. Her body still faced away from us, creating a grotesque tableau that violated everything I knew about human anatomy. The smile didn't falter, didn't change, remained fixed like a mask. Her empty gaze was fixed on something far away, something I couldn't see but that seemed to hold her complete attention. "He left us. He's not coming back," she said, her tone almost cheerful now, like she was sharing something trivial, like she was commenting on what we'd had for breakfast. The mop resumed its scraping, that horrible rhythmic sound filling the kitchen. Her body shifted back into that unnatural rhythm, resuming the pointless motion. But now her head remained turned toward us, watching us with those dead eyes, even as her body faced away and continued its mechanical task. I grabbed Vanessa's hand and pulled her backward, moving as quickly as I dared without making sudden movements. I could feel her trembling, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts that bordered on hyperventilation. "We need to go," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady, even as my own panic threatened to overwhelm me. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew that wasn't our mother. Not anymore. Something else was wearing her like a suit, puppeting her body, using her voice to say things she would never say. We backed out of the kitchen, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. I could hear the scraping behind us, steady, unchanging, mechanical, as if she hadn't noticed we were leaving, or as if she was letting us go for now, confident that we couldn't escape. We made it to the stairs, and I pushed Vanessa ahead of me, urging her up with gentle pressure on her back. The wood creaked beneath our feet, each sound echoing through the silent house like gunshots. Each sound announced our position, our intent, our fear. My heart pounded in my chest, fear clawing at my insides like a living thing trying to escape. Halfway up, the scraping stopped. Silence, the kind that made your skin prickle, made you hold your breath, made every hair on your body stand at attention, the silence of a predator preparing to strike. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, wrong. They echoed up the hallway with too many impacts, as if the thing walking had more than two legs. The sound of something dragging behind, something heavy being pulled across the floor. Vanessa looked back at me, her eyes wide with terror, her face drained of all color. I knew we had to move faster. We reached the top of the stairs, and I turned, catching a glimpse of the kitchen below. For a moment I saw her, her head tilted back at that impossible angle, her eyes staring up at me, glowing faintly in the darkness with their own internal light. Her lips curled back, revealing not just teeth but something else, something that shouldn't be in a human mouth. She let out a low guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls, through the floor, through my very bones. The sound was layered, multiple voices growling in harmony. A choir of malevolence that made my bladder clench and my legs go weak. I shoved Vanessa into my room and slammed the door shut behind us with all my strength. The pounding came almost instantly, hard, relentless, violent enough to send shudders through the entire door frame. The sound of wood splintering, of something impossibly strong trying to break through. I could hear her voice now, but it wasn't hers anymore. It was filled with rage, with hunger, snarling and demanding we let her in. Words in no language I recognized, guttural and harsh, punctuated by that horrible growling. The door shook under the force of each impact, the wood actually bowing inward with each strike. The frame cracked, splinters flying inward with each hit. Long gouges appeared in the wood, 4 parallel scratches that looked exactly like the marks we'd seen on the doorframe downstairs. I grabbed my dresser and pushed it against the door, Vanessa helping despite her trembling. We piled everything we could find against it. My desk, my bookshelf, chairs, anything that might buy us a few more seconds. But I could see the door bending, could see the metal hinges starting to pull free from the frame. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know how this nightmare had started, or how it would end. But as I looked at Vanessa, saw the pure terror in her 17-year-old eyes, I knew we couldn't stay here. Whatever was pretending to be our mother, it wanted us, and it wouldn't stop until it had us. "Out the window," I said, my voice trembling but determined. We had to escape before it was too late. The cold night air hit us as we climbed out the window, a shocking contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. The lattice swayed beneath our weight, creaking ominously with each movement. My fingers gripped the vine-covered wood so tightly I could feel splinters digging into my palms. I glanced down at Vanessa. She was moving quickly, her eyes wide, her breath coming in shallow gasps. I couldn't blame her. My own chest felt like it was going to explode from the fear that had wrapped itself around me like a constricting snake. Behind us I could still hear that thing throwing itself against my bedroom door. The sounds of wood splintering grew louder, more urgent. We were running out of time. I kept my eyes on Vanessa, urging her down with whispered encouragement. The lattice groaned under my weight as I followed her descent. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the leaves with a violence that seemed supernatural. Somewhere in the distance I heard it, that low guttural growl echoing through the night, coming not from the house but from the woods. It sent terror racing through every nerve ending, and I pushed myself to move faster. We needed to get to the car, get out of here before whatever was inside that house came after us, or before whatever was in the woods found us again. Vanessa reached the ground first, her shoes landing with a soft thud in the grass. I followed, my feet slipping for a moment on the dewy vegetation before I caught myself. I glanced back up at the window, half expecting to see that monstrous face staring down at us, that grotesque smile watching our escape. It was empty, dark. The door was still holding, but I could see movement in the shadows behind it. I didn't let myself dwell on it for too long. I grabbed Vanessa's hand and we ran. Our feet pounded across the lawn toward the driveway, leaving impressions in the soft grass. The car was there, parked where I had left it earlier, looking normal and mundane in a world that had become anything but. I fumbled for the keys in my pocket, my fingers trembling so badly I almost dropped them. The metal felt foreign in my shaking hands. Vanessa was already at the passenger door, her hand on the handle, her eyes darting back toward the house with terrified frequency. She looked at me, her expression desperate, pleading. "Hurry," she urged, her voice low and tight with fear. I finally got the key into the lock, yanked the door open, and we both climbed in. The familiar smell of the car's interior was oddly comforting, a reminder of normalcy in this nightmare. I twisted the key in the ignition. The car roared to life, the engine sound breaking the oppressive silence of the night. The headlights flickered on, illuminating the driveway and the figure standing in front of us. It was Mom, or at least it looked like her. She stood in the center of the driveway, blocking our path, her head tilted at that unnatural angle we'd seen inside. Her arms hung limply at her sides, swaying slightly in the breeze like pendulums. Her hollow eyes were fixed on us, tracking us through the windshield with disturbing precision. Her mouth opened slowly, her lips parting as if she was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Just that black void where her voice should be. My heart clenched, every instinct warring inside me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. For a moment I hesitated. That was my mother standing there, the woman who had raised me, who had bandaged my scraped knees and taught me to ride a bike, the woman who had stayed up with me during thunderstorms and cheered at every school play. I could feel Vanessa's eyes on me, her breath hitching in her throat. "What are you waiting for?" she asked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "That's not Mom. You have to go. That thing isn't her anymore." She was right. Deep down I knew it. Whatever was standing in front of us wore Mom's body like a costume, but there was nothing of her left inside. I took a deep breath, pressing my foot down on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward with a squeal of tires. The figure in front of us moved, almost gliding out of the way with impossible grace, her feet not quite touching the ground. Her head snapped toward us as we passed, rotating a full 180 degrees. Her mouth twisted into that horrible grin, a toothy grimace that stretched too far across her face, literally ear to ear, splitting her cheeks. I heard Vanessa let out a choked sob beside me, and I pressed the gas harder. The tires spun in the gravel as we sped away from the house, throwing stones against the undercarriage with sharp pinging sounds. In the rearview mirror, I could see the figure standing in the driveway, perfectly still now, watching us go. Even at this distance, I could see those eyes glowing in the darkness. The road stretched out before us, winding through the darkness like a snake. The headlights illuminated only a few feet ahead, the tunnel of light seeming inadequate against the pressing darkness on all sides. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, my heart still pounding in my ears like a war drum. Vanessa was silent beside me, her eyes fixed on the road, her face pale as paper in the dashboard lights. I glanced at her, trying to find the right words. But what could I say? Nothing about this was okay. Nothing about this made sense. Our mother was gone, replaced by something that wore her skin. Our home was violated, invaded by forces I couldn't begin to understand, and somewhere out there in the darkness, something was hunting us. The car's headlights caught movement up ahead, a flash of something dark darting across the road, something large and fast. I slammed on the brakes without thinking. The tires screeched in protest as we skidded to a stop, the anti-lock brakes pulsing beneath my foot. We stopped mere inches from whatever had crossed our path. For a moment, everything was silent except for the tick of the cooling engine. I held my breath, my eyes scanning the darkness on either side of the road, looking for any sign of what we'd almost hit. Vanessa let out a soft whimper, her hand gripping the edge of her seat so hard I thought she might tear the upholstery. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the idle of the engine. I shook my head, my eyes darting back and forth, searching for any sign of movement. The woods were thick here, the trees pressing in close to the road on both sides. The shadows were deep, impenetrable, hiding God knows what. I could feel something watching us from the darkness, studying us with malevolent intelligence. Then there it was again, a shadow shifting between the trees, a flash of those red eyes reflecting our headlights. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, my breath catching in my throat. It was following us. Whatever it was, whatever had come for us in the woods behind our house, it wasn't done yet. It had tracked us somehow, followed us along roads it shouldn't know, pursuing us with single-minded determination. I pressed the gas again, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. The car jerked forward, tires finding purchase on the asphalt. I drove faster this time, my eyes locked on the road ahead, my peripheral vision filled with writhing shadows. I didn't know where we were going, just away from the house, away from the thing that had taken our mother, away from the horror that had invaded our lives. The road twisted and turned, each curve seemingly sharper than the last. The trees pressed in on either side, their branches like claws reaching for us, scraping against the sides of the car with sounds like fingernails on a chalkboard. Vanessa was rigid in her seat, her eyes wide, her body tense as a bowstring. I could still hear that growl in my head, still see the way those eyes had glowed in the darkness, imprinted on my retinas like afterimages. We had to get away. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw them. Those red eyes glowing in the darkness behind us, keeping pace with the car despite our speed. Relentless, inevitable, and I knew deep down that we couldn't run forever. Whatever this thing was, it had marked us, chosen us, and it would follow us to the ends of the earth if necessary. The speedometer climbed higher, 50, 60, 70 miles per hour on roads meant for 35. The car shook with the speed, bouncing over imperfections in the asphalt. Vanessa braced herself against the dashboard, her knuckles white. "It's still there," she said, her voice hollow with despair. "It's still following us." I knew. I could see it in the mirror. Those burning red coals that never blinked, never wavered, never fell behind no matter how fast we went. The thing didn't seem to be running. It was just there, always the same distance back, as if our speed meant nothing to it. We drove until the road seemed to stretch into oblivion, until the headlights began to blur in my tired eyes and my arms ached from gripping the steering wheel. The world outside the car was an endless black that pressed in on us from all sides, trying to smother us. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thud of my own heartbeat, an endless pulse that seemed to synchronize with the tension building inside the car. Vanessa hadn't said a word since her last observation about our pursuer. Her hands were clenched in her lap so tightly her fingernails had drawn blood from her palms, leaving dark crescents in her skin. After what felt like hours of driving, I finally pulled off onto a narrow gravel road that led to a small clearing. The car rolled to a stop, and I killed the engine, plunging us into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the dashboard clock. Silence swallowed us whole. For a moment I just sat there, staring at the steering wheel, trying to catch my breath and slow my racing heart. My entire body ached with exhaustion and terror. Vanessa finally looked over at me, her face pale, her eyes haunted by what we'd seen and experienced. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, cracking on the last word. There was a tremor there, a fear that mirrored my own, amplified by the uncertainty of our situation. I swallowed hard, looking out into the blackness of the forest that surrounded us. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their branches like skeletal arms reaching up to the sky, as if trying to escape the earth below. The moon was nowhere to be seen, hidden behind thick clouds that promised rain. "We wait," I said, my voice sounding hollow and unconvincing even to me. "We wait for dawn, then we drive to the nearest town and find help." I didn't know what else to say. We were lost, not just in the physical sense, but in every possible way. Our home was gone, invaded and corrupted by forces beyond our understanding. Our mother, whatever had happened to her, was gone, replaced by something that wore her face like a mask. And the only thing I knew for sure was that we couldn't go back. There was nothing to go back to. Vanessa nodded slowly, her eyes shifting back to the windshield, staring out at the darkness that seemed to pulse with hidden life. "You think it's still out there?" she asked after a long moment, her voice trembling with barely controlled fear. I didn't have to ask what she meant. I nodded slowly, my throat tightening with the admission. Yeah, I said, the word coming out rough and harsh. It's out there. The words felt heavy, like admitting it made it more real, gave it more power over us. I could still see those eyes, those red glowing eyes watching us from the shadows, studying us like prey. It had followed us for miles, through turns it couldn't possibly have anticipated, at speeds nothing on foot should have maintained. It knew where we were, and I was certain it wouldn't stop. Not until it got what it wanted. Whatever that was. I reached over, taking Vanessa's hand in mine. Her fingers were cold, her grip tight enough to hurt. Desperate for human contact in a world that had become inhumanly terrifying. We'll figure this out, I said, though I didn't know if I believed it myself. When the sun comes up, we'll find help. Police, park rangers, someone who can help us understand what's happening. The fear in her eyes was mirrored in my own, and I knew we were running out of time. Whatever this thing was, whatever had invaded our home and our lives, it was getting closer. The forest was quiet, too quiet. There was no rustling of leaves, no distant calls of night birds, no chittering of insects, just silence pressing in on us, suffocating in its completeness. The natural symphony of the forest was absent, as if every living thing had fled or been silenced. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, any hint that we weren't alone, but there was nothing. Only the sound of our breathing, ragged and uneven, and the rapid drumbeat of my pulse in my ears. Then I heard it. A rustling, faint but unmistakable, the snap of a twig breaking under weight. My eyes snapped open, though I hadn't realized I'd closed them. I looked at Vanessa. She heard it too. Her eyes were wide, her body tense, every muscle coiled and ready to run. The sound came again, closer this time. A soft shuffling like something moving through the leaves. Deliberately, carefully, stalking. Not trying to be quiet, but not rushing either. The confident movement of a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to go. Do you hear that? Vanessa whispered, her voice barely audible, almost lost in the oppressive silence. I nodded, unable to speak, my throat too tight with fear. The rustling grew louder, closer, coming from multiple directions now. And then I saw them, two glowing red eyes staring at us from the edge of the clearing, hovering in the darkness about 7 feet off the ground. My breath caught in my throat, every instinct screaming at me to move, to run, to do anything but sit here like a sacrifice waiting for the knife. I felt Vanessa's hand tighten around mine, her fingernails digging into my skin hard enough to draw blood. It was here. It had found us. There was no escape. I didn't think. I just moved. My hand shot to the ignition, jamming the key in and twisting. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence with mechanical fury. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the creature fully for the first time. It was worse than I remembered. The thing stood at least 8 feet tall, its body a twisted mockery of human form. The skull-like head was covered in patches of rotting flesh, maggots writhing in the exposed tissue. The arms were too long, ending in hands with too many joints, each finger tipped with a claw that looked like it could tear through metal. The body was emaciated, ribs visible through translucent, diseased skin that seemed to pulse with its own horrible life. Those red eyes blinked and then they were gone. Not retreating, but simply vanishing as if they'd never been there at all. But I knew better. It was still there, just invisible now, hidden in the spaces between light and shadow. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The car lurched forward, tires spinning in the gravel before finding traction. We shot out of the clearing, the engine screaming in protest as I pushed it beyond its limits. I didn't know where we were going. I didn't care. All I knew was that we couldn't stay there. Whatever was out in those woods, it wasn't going to stop until it had us, until it had finished whatever horrible purpose had drawn it to our family. The road twisted and turned, barely visible in the headlights. Trees blurred past, their trunks appearing and disappearing in flashes. I kept the gas pedal down, the speedometer needle climbing into dangerous territory for these narrow, winding roads. "We have to tell someone," Vanessa said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "We can't keep running forever. We need help." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion and fear. She was right. We needed help. But who would believe us? Who would believe any of this? that our mother had been possessed or replaced by something inhuman, that a creature from nightmares was stalking us through the woods. It sounded insane even to me, and I had lived through it. I glanced at her, her face pale in the dim light of the dashboard, her eyes still wide with terror but showing determination too. My little sister, forced to grow up in a single horrific night. "We will," I said, forcing confidence into my voice. "We'll find someone. The police, the sheriff, someone. We'll make them listen." The red eyes were still in my mind, haunting me, imprinted on my memory like a brand. I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot, but as long as we were alive, as long as we had each other, we had a chance. And I was going to fight for Vanessa. I was going to fight for whatever was left of our family, whatever future we might still have. I pressed the gas harder, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The car sped down the dark, winding road, and I made a silent promise to myself, to Vanessa, to whatever God might still be listening in this nightmare. We weren't going to be its victims. Not tonight. Not ever. The sky began to lighten imperceptibly at first. Then, with growing confidence as we drove, the oppressive darkness that had surrounded us for hours slowly gave way to the gray of pre-dawn. With the light came a sense of relief so powerful it almost made me cry. We had survived the night. I pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of a small town called Cedar Falls, a place I'd never heard of but that looked like salvation. The fluorescent lights of the station were harsh after hours of darkness, but they were beautiful, artificial, human, safe. I parked the car and killed the engine, and for a moment Vanessa and I just sat there, unable to move. "We made it," Vanessa whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since we'd escaped. Her face was scratched from branches, her clothes torn, her eyes red from crying. But she was alive. We both were. "Yeah," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "We made it." I opened the car door and stepped out into the cool morning air. My legs were shaky, barely able to support my weight. Every muscle in my body ached. But we were alive, and that was what mattered. Inside the gas station, a clerk looked up from his magazine, his eyes widening as he took in our appearance. I must have looked as bad as Vanessa, scratched, bleeding, clothes filthy and torn. "You kids okay?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain what had happened? How could I make anyone understand? "We need to call the police," I finally managed. "Please, we need help." The clerk reached for the phone without question, his expression serious now. As he dialed, I looked out the window at the car where Vanessa still sat, staring at nothing. The morning sun was breaking over the horizon now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was beautiful. Normal. A world where physics worked the way it should, where mothers were mothers and shadows were just the absence of light. But I knew the truth now. I knew what lurked in the deep woods, what could wear a human face and mimic a human voice. I knew that there were things in this world that defied explanation, that violated every rule of nature and sanity. As the clerk spoke to the dispatcher, I made another promise to myself. We would tell our story, and somehow, some way, we would make people believe. We would make sure that whatever had happened to our family, whatever had taken our mother, would never happen to anyone else. The nightmare wasn't over. I knew that. Whatever had hunted us through those woods was still out there, probably waiting, probably watching. But in the growing light of dawn, with help on the way, and my sister safe beside me, I felt something I hadn't felt since this all began. Hope. We had survived the night. And if we could do that, maybe, just maybe, we could survive what came next. The police would come. We would tell them everything. And whatever happened after that, we would face it together. Because that's what family does. Even when the world becomes a nightmare, even when the impossible becomes real, family endures. And we would too. Lake of the Woods had been my refuge for 42 years, a vast labyrinth of frozen water stretching across the border between Minnesota and Ontario. I'm Graham Hutchins, and I'd made this pilgrimage every winter since I was 23, sometimes bringing my wife Catherine, though she always preferred our summer cabin near the Boundary Waters. When the disease finally claimed her this past August, after 18 brutal months of watching her fade, everything in my world shifted. The colors seemed duller, food lost its taste, sleep became a stranger. This winter, at 65 years old, I needed the ice more than ever. I needed to vanish into the white expanse, to lose myself in the methodical rhythm of ice fishing, where the only sounds were wind across frozen water and the occasional crack of shifting ice plates. The isolation wasn't loneliness, it was survival. I loaded my equipment onto the sled behind my snowmobile before sunrise on a Thursday morning in late January. The temperature hovered at 8 degrees below zero, and my breath crystallized instantly in the pre-dawn darkness. Ice auger, propane heater, sleeping cot, Coleman lantern, 3 days worth of canned stew and beans, 20 gallons of water, extra fuel canisters, emergency flares, and my grandfather's .22 rifle, though I'd never needed it for anything more than scaring off curious foxes. As I throttled the snowmobile onto the frozen lake, pale morning light began spreading across the eastern horizon, turning the endless white surface into something that resembled an alien landscape. I drove deeper into the wilderness, following the familiar route toward the isolated chain of islands locals called Devil's Elbow. The name had always seemed melodramatic, but the area suited my needs perfectly, miles from the fishing resorts, hours from the nearest town, and far enough from civilization that I could pretend the rest of the world had ceased to exist. The ride took 90 minutes, and with each passing mile, I felt the tension in my shoulders gradually ease. Out here, there were no sympathetic neighbors asking how I was holding up. No well-meaning friends suggesting grief counseling. No empty house echoing with Catherine's absence. Just wind, ice, and silence. I stopped near the southern tip of the largest island, a pine-covered mass of rock that rose perhaps 30 feet above the frozen lake surface. Following decades of ingrained caution, I checked the ice thickness with my manual auger, drilling down until I hit water, 19 inches. More than adequate. Anything over 15 was considered safe for vehicles. Setting up the portable shack took 20 minutes of practice movements. The heavy canvas walls snapped taut in the wind as I anchored the frame to the ice with long screws. Inside, I arranged my minimal living space. The narrow cot against the back wall, propane heater positioned safely away from the canvas, Coleman lantern hanging from the central support pole, and my fishing gear organized within easy reach. I drilled my fishing hole dead center in the shack, watching ice chips spiral up the auger until dark water appeared below. The hole measured 10 inches across, and I could see the water moving beneath the ice, a reminder that despite the solid surface above, the lake remained very much alive below. After baiting my tip up with a lively shiner minnow, I lowered the line and settled onto my cot with a paperback western I'd read 3 times before. The first afternoon passed in comfortable monotony. I caught 2 small perch, threw them both back, and heated a can of beef stew for dinner as the sun descended toward the western horizon. The temperature inside the shack dropped steadily despite the heater's efforts, and I pulled on an extra layer of thermal underwear before climbing into my sleeping bag. For the first time in 8 months, I fell asleep without lying awake for hours, tormented by memories of hospital rooms and morphine drips and Catherine's final labored breaths. Out here, exhaustion claimed me quickly, and I drifted into dreamless darkness. I woke on Friday morning feeling more rested than I had since Catherine's diagnosis. Frost had formed intricate patterns on the inside of the canvas walls overnight, and my breath emerged in thick white clouds. The thermometer hanging near the door read -6 degrees. Outside, weak sunlight filtered through high, thin clouds, casting the frozen landscape in shades of gray and white. After a breakfast of instant coffee and granola bars, I decided to explore. My old friend Byron Keller maintained a small ice shack about 3 miles north, though he'd stopped using it regularly after moving to Arizona 5 years ago for his arthritis. I'd promised to check on the structure whenever I came out, making sure heavy snow hadn't collapsed the roof or that vandals hadn't broken in. The snowmobile journey took 15 minutes across smooth ice. Byron's shack sat in the shelter of a small pine grove, weathered but still sturdy. As expected, everything was locked up tight, and the surrounding snow showed no signs of recent visitors. On impulse, I drilled a test hole nearby, and was immediately rewarded. Within 20 minutes, I'd pulled up 3 decent-sized walleye. I marked the GPS coordinates on my handheld unit and made a mental note to return. The ride back to my own shack was uneventful. But as I approached, something made me slow the snowmobile and cut the engine. In the sudden silence, I sat listening. The wind had died completely, leaving the frozen lake wrapped in an unnatural stillness that seemed to press against my eardrums. Even the usual distant sounds, ice groaning as it expanded and contracted, ravens calling from the tree line, were absent. I shook off the uneasy feeling and restarted the engine. The roar seemed obscenely loud in the quiet. Inside the shack, I heated water for coffee and settled in for the afternoon. The fish weren't biting, but that was fine. I wasn't really here for the fish anyway. As the afternoon wore on, clouds thickened overhead, transforming the dim daylight into premature dusk. By 4 o'clock, darkness was already gathering at the edges of the frozen world. I lit the Coleman lantern and prepared dinner. Another can of stew, eaten directly from the pot to minimize cleanup. The wind had picked up again, buffeting the canvas walls and making the frame creak. Normal sounds, familiar sounds, nothing to worry about. I read by lantern light until my eyes grew heavy, then extinguished the flame and burrowed into my sleeping bag. The darkness inside the shack was absolute, the kind of blackness that made you doubt whether your eyes were actually open. I lay listening to the wind, to the occasional snap of the canvas, to the settling groans of the ice beneath me. Sleep came slowly this time. The sound that jerked me into full wakefulness was unmistakable, the crunch of footsteps on crusted snow. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. My watch read 2:47 a.m. The wind had stopped, leaving only thick silence broken by those steady, measured footsteps. They circled the shack slowly, deliberately, each crunch distinct and heavy. My first thought was another fisherman, perhaps someone whose vehicle had broken down seeking help. But something about the rhythm of those steps felt wrong. Too slow, too purposeful. And why circle the shack rather than approach the door? I eased myself out of the sleeping bag as quietly as possible, every movement seeming thunderously loud despite my caution. The footsteps continued their circuit, unhurried and methodical. I crept toward the narrow observation slit in the canvas near the door and peered out into the night. Moonlight transformed the frozen lake into a silvery expanse, bright enough to see clearly for hundreds of yards. The ice stretched empty in all directions. No snowmobile, no figure, nothing. Yet the footsteps continued, now passing along the side wall of the shack, so close I could hear the slight squeak of compressed snow. My hands trembled as I backed away from the window. Every rational part of my brain insisted someone must be out there, even if I couldn't see them from my limited vantage point. But a deeper, more primitive part of my consciousness whispered that something was fundamentally wrong with this situation. The footsteps completed their circle and started a second lap, then a third, each circuit identical to the last, maintaining the same steady pace, the same interval between steps. I stood paralyzed in the center of the shack, unable to move or speak, feeling like prey being evaluated by a predator. After what might have been 10 minutes or an hour, time had become meaningless. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. I waited, muscles locked, breathing shallow, for something to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, I forced myself to sit back on the cot, though I couldn't bring myself to lie down. I sat upright in the darkness, wrapped in my sleeping bag, listening with every fiber of my being for any return of that sound. None came. When gray dawn light finally began filtering through the canvas, I'd been awake for over 4 hours. My body ached with tension. My eyes burned from staring into darkness, and my hands shook as I fumbled to light the propane heater. I needed coffee. I needed warmth. I needed to see what, if anything, waited outside. Morning revealed itself reluctantly, the sun obscured behind heavy clouds that promised snow. I sat drinking coffee with both hands wrapped around the metal cup, trying to convince myself that I'd experienced a dream or perhaps the acoustic tricks that ice and wind can play in the deep wilderness. But I knew I hadn't been dreaming. Finally, as full daylight established itself, I pulled on my parka and boots and unzipped the shack's door. Cold air rushed in, sharp enough to sting my lungs. I stepped out onto the ice, immediately scanning the surrounding area for any sign of a visitor. What I found drained the warmth from my body more effectively than any wind. Footprints encircled the shack in a perfect ring, pressed deeply into the granular snow that had accumulated over the previous day. But these weren't normal boot prints. They were elongated, easily 14 or 15 inches long and strangely narrow. The depressions were deep. Whoever or whatever made them carried significant weight. Each print showed what appeared to be 5 distinct toe impressions spreading wider at the front. I knelt beside one print, my knees creaking with age and cold. The indentations were sharp-edged, recent, made within the last few hours. I followed the ring around the shack, noting how perfectly circular it was, how consistent the spacing between each step. What froze the blood in my veins wasn't just the oddity of the prints themselves. It was where they began and ended. Halfway across the open ice between my shack and the island, the prints simply appeared, starting mid-stride as if whatever made them had materialized from thin air. I followed them around their complete circuit, then watched them end just as abruptly 20 yards from where they began, the final print deep and clear, followed by nothing but unmarked snow. No trail led to or from the circle. Just those prints, appearing and disappearing like an impossible equation. I stood in the frigid morning air, trying to force my mind toward rational explanations. Wind couldn't have erased only certain prints while leaving others pristine. Another person couldn't have hopped backward in their own footprints. Not in a perfect circle. Animals didn't walk in perfect circles around human structures. And certainly no animal I knew made prints like these. My hands fumbled with the radio as I retreated to the shack. I needed to talk to someone, to hear another human voice confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. "This is Graham Hutchins, camped at Devil's Elbow, requesting radio check." I released the transmit button and waited. Only static answered. I tried again. "Any station. This is Graham Hutchins on the ice at Devil's Elbow. Does anyone copy?" Nothing but the hiss of empty air. My cell phone showed the same useless situation it had since I'd driven onto the ice. No service. The nearest cell tower was 40 miles away. I was completely isolated, cut off from any quick means of contact with the outside world. The smart thing would be to pack up immediately and head back to the ranger station. But looking at the sky, seeing the gray underbelly of storm clouds moving in, I knew I'd be fighting deteriorating conditions if I left now. The weather forecast before I'd come out had predicted a front moving through this afternoon, bringing snow and wind that would make travel dangerous, potentially impossible. I had to make a decision. Leave now and risk getting caught in the storm, or wait it out and leave in clear conditions tomorrow morning. Despite every instinct screaming at me to flee, I decided to stay. I rationalized the choice in multiple ways. The storm would hit within hours. My snowmobile was old and unreliable in the best conditions. Traveling 40 miles across open ice in near whiteout conditions was suicidal. All true statements. But underneath the rational arguments lurked something else. A stubborn refusal to be driven away by fear I couldn't explain or understand. I spent the late morning reinforcing my shack, adding extra tie-downs and piling snow around the base for added stability against the coming wind. Physical work helped calm my mind, giving me something concrete to focus on besides those impossible footprints that I could still see from my window. By noon, the first snowflakes began falling, small and hard, driven horizontally by increasing wind. I retreated inside, fired up the heater, and tried to settle into the familiar routine of ice fishing. The line hung motionless in the black water below. Nothing bit. I kept glancing toward the window, expecting to see a figure standing out on the ice, watching. The empty white expanse revealed nothing. As afternoon deepened toward evening, I found myself thinking about Byron's shack. The thought nagged at me, persistent and uncomfortable. I'd checked it that morning, found it secure and undisturbed. But something pulled at my attention, some detail my conscious mind hadn't fully registered, but my subconscious kept circling back to. The snow was falling heavier now, visibility dropping to less than 100 yards. Going out in this would be foolish, dangerous, exactly the kind of mistake that got people killed in the wilderness. I went anyway. The ride to Byron's shack took twice as long as it had that morning. Wind-driven snow stung my face despite my balaclava, and I had to navigate purely by compass and GPS, unable to see more than a few yards ahead. Part of me recognized the stupidity of this expedition, but a stronger part insisted I had to see Byron's shack again. When I arrived, my headlight beam revealed something that stopped my heart. The front wall of the shack had been destroyed, not damaged by weather or torn by wind, but violently ripped outward. Heavy plywood planks splintered and scattered across the ice like matchsticks. I killed the engine and dismounted slowly, approaching on foot. Snow had already begun accumulating inside the structure, but I could still see enough to understand that something terrible had happened here. The interior was devastated. Byron's old cot had been shredded, metal frame twisted into impossible angles. The canvas roof hung in tatters. Storage containers lay crushed and scattered. And blood. God help me, so much blood. Dark frozen smears covered the floorboards, splattered up the remaining walls, pooled in the corners. The quantity suggested a catastrophic injury, yet there was no body. I searched frantically through the wreckage, though part of me didn't want to find what I was looking for. Nothing. No corpse, no remains, just blood and destruction. The fishing equipment sat untouched. Byron's old tackle box remained closed and intact. The propane heater stood upright in the corner, unmarked. Whatever had torn apart this shack and whoever had bled here, they weren't interested in theft or vandalism. This was violence for violence's sake. This was fury made manifest. I backed out of the ruined structure, my breath coming in rapid gasps that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The snow fell harder, already obscuring my snowmobile tracks from the ride over. I needed to leave. Now. The ride back to my shack was a nightmare of whiteout conditions and mounting panic. Wind buffeted me from all directions, and twice I nearly collided with pressure ridges hidden by blowing snow. When I finally spotted the dim outline of my canvas structure, relief washed through me with physical force. Inside, I collapsed onto the cot, shaking violently. The temperature had dropped further, and my thermometer now read -18. The storm would rage all night, trapping me here regardless of my wishes. I tried the radio again, still nothing but static. I tried my cell phone, still no service. As darkness claimed the frozen lake, I sat with my grandfather's rifle across my lap, listening to wind scream across the ice, actually praying to God for the first time since Catherine's funeral, that dawn would come quickly and bring clear skies. The storm intensified as night deepened, wind howling around the shack with such force that I worried the structure might tear free from its anchors. Snow hammered against the canvas in waves, sometimes soft and almost gentle, sometimes hard as thrown gravel. The propane heater struggled against the cold infiltrating through every gap and seam. I didn't even pretend I might sleep. I sat upright on the cot, rifle beside me, listening to the storm and watching the yellow circle of lantern light that seemed to grow smaller and more fragile as the hours passed. The howl, when it came, was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It cut through the storm's roar, a sound that seemed to originate from somewhere impossibly deep, resonating with harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. The cry was mournful and hungry and enraged all at once, expressing emotions I had no names for. It echoed across the frozen expanse, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Every hair on my body stood on end. My hands gripped the rifle so tightly my knuckles ached. The howl came again, closer this time, and beneath it I could hear another sound, footsteps crunching through the fresh snow, approaching steadily despite the storm. I moved to the observation window and pressed my face against the cold canvas, peering out into the maelstrom. At first I saw nothing but horizontal snow and darkness. Then, at the very edge of the lantern's light bleeding through the canvas, I spotted movement. A figure stood at the tree line of the nearest island, perhaps 50 yards away. Tall, impossibly tall. Even hunched as it was, I estimated its height at over 7 feet. It stood perfectly still despite the wind that would have staggered any normal person, and though I couldn't make out details through the driving snow, I could see its head was turned toward my shack. It was watching me. We remained frozen in that tableau for seconds or minutes. I couldn't tell. Then the figure took a step forward. Another. It moved with a strange, loping gait, arms hanging low, almost reaching its knees. Each step covered an impossible distance, and it was crossing the ice toward me with horrifying speed. I stumbled backward from the window, heart hammering, mind blank with fear. The footsteps grew louder, crunching through snow and crust, coming straight for the shack. I raised the rifle with shaking hands, aimed at the canvas wall, waiting for something to tear through. The footsteps stopped directly outside. Silence fell, broken only by wind and the pounding of blood in my ears. I kept the rifle trained on the wall, finger resting lightly on the trigger, hardly daring to breathe. Then came the sound that would haunt me forever. A single deliberate tap against the canvas. Knock. Like someone requesting entry. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't think beyond the primal terror that had seized every muscle. Another tap. Softer this time. Almost gentle. Then nothing. Minutes passed. The wind continued howling. Snow continued falling. But the presence outside had vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving me alone in the fragile shelter with only my racing heart and the certain knowledge that something was out there in the storm, circling in the darkness, waiting. I remained rigid on the cot for hours, rifle never wavering from the door, until sheer exhaustion finally dragged me into a twilight state that wasn't quite sleep, but wasn't consciousness either. Nightmares flitted through this half-awareness. Catherine calling to me from the ice, her voice mixing with that terrible howl, footprints appearing in impossible patterns, a tall shadow with burning eyes standing just beyond my vision. Dawn brought clearing skies and deadly cold. The thermometer read -24 degrees. My water bottles had frozen solid overnight despite being inside the shack. When I tried to stand, every joint protested, stiff from cold and the tension of staying motionless for so long. I didn't bother with breakfast or coffee. I didn't check my fishing line. I focused on one goal, getting off this frozen hell as quickly as humanly possible. My hands shook as I disconnected the propane heater and began shoving gear into the sled. Organization didn't matter. I threw items in randomly. Lantern, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, anything I could grab. The rifle I kept separate, loading it and setting it within easy reach. Through the canvas I could see sunlight glinting off fresh snow, making the lake's surface almost painfully bright. The storm had deposited at least 6 inches of new powder, which would slow my progress but wouldn't stop the snowmobile. As I worked, I kept glancing toward the tree line, searching for any sign of the figure I'd seen last night. Nothing moved among the pines, but I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed, of invisible eyes tracking my every movement. I secured the last strap on the sled and collapsed the shack frame, working with frantic urgency. Every second here felt like tempting fate. The canvas folded awkwardly, refusing to cooperate with my shaking hands, but I finally wrestled it into a manageable bundle and strapped it to the sled. The snowmobile started on the first pull, engine roaring into life. The sound was absurdly comforting, mechanical, normal, human. I mounted quickly, settled the rifle across my lap, and opened the throttle. For the first 2 miles, I allowed myself to believe I would make it. The morning was clear and bright. The fresh snow provided good traction. The ranger outpost lay only 12 miles distant. In less than an hour, I'd be among people, safe, able to tell someone what I'd experienced. Then I checked the rearview mirror and saw it. A dark shape moved across the white expanse behind me, covering ground with an unnaturally fluid motion. Even at this distance, I could see it wasn't running like a human. Its gait was all wrong, more like a loping stride with arms swinging low and powerful. But it was fast. God, it was fast. Terror flooded through me, cold and sharp. I twisted the throttle wide open, engine screaming in protest. The snowmobile surged forward, bucking over hidden drifts and ridges. In the mirror, the shape maintained its pursuit, closing the distance with each glance. I risked a longer look over my shoulder, and immediately wished I hadn't. In the harsh morning light, I could see it clearly now, tall and gaunt, with skin the color of dirty ice pulled tight over prominent bones. Its face was too long, too narrow, with features that seemed almost human, but distorted in subtle ways that made my mind recoil. And its eyes, even from this distance, I could see its eyes, wide and dark and filled with something that looked like hunger. My hand fumbled for the flare gun in my parka pocket. I'd fired one yesterday, and had 3 remaining. The snowmobile hit a rough patch and nearly threw me, forcing me to focus on control rather than looking back. When I checked the mirror again, the thing had closed to within 30 yards. I pulled out the flare gun one-handed, pointed it skyward at an angle, and fired. The flare rocketed up in a streak of burning magnesium, exploding in a brilliant starburst that left purple afterimages in my vision. The pursuing figure flinched back from the sudden light, throwing one long arm across its face. For several seconds it stopped completely, giving me precious distance. But then it resumed the chase, and if anything it moved faster now, as though angered by my resistance. The ice ahead looked different, darker. with visible cracks radiating outward. Slush pockets, areas where the extreme cold and recent thaw had left the surface unstable. In better circumstances, I would have slowed down, tested the ice carefully, found a safe route around. I had no choice but to keep going. The snowmobile skis hit the first slush pocket at full speed. Icy water sprayed up, soaking my legs. The machine stuttered but powered through. Behind me, I heard a sound like enraged frustration. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something that combined both. 50 yards ahead, I could see solid ice and the dark smudge of the tree line beyond. Safety. I just needed to reach. The ice beneath me gave way without warning. One moment I was racing across a solid surface. The next, the snowmobile's front end plunged down, hitting hidden water with tremendous force. The impact threw me forward, and I tumbled over the handlebars into frigid slush that instantly soaked through my clothes. The shock of cold water was indescribable. Every nerve in my body seemed to ignite with pain. I thrashed instinctively, trying to find purchase, but my boots and heavy parka were dragging me down. The snowmobile's engine died with a gurgling hiss as water poured over it. Behind me, I heard rapid footsteps approaching, splashing through the slush. Terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I kicked violently, grabbed the edge of solid ice, and hauled myself up and forward. The ice cracked under my weight, but held long enough for me to crawl several more feet. Behind me, the water churned as something entered the broken section. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I focused entirely on moving forward, dragging myself across ice that creaked and groaned with every movement. My soaked clothes had already begun freezing in the extreme cold, making movement increasingly difficult. The solid ice of the shoreline seemed impossibly far away, but I kept crawling, kept moving, even as I heard splashing behind me and felt the ice shudder with impacts. 20 yards, 15, 10. A sound erupted behind me, that terrible howl mixed with something that sounded almost like words, though in no language I'd ever heard. The ice beneath me shuddered violently. 5 yards from shore, I found my feet and staggered forward in a clumsy run, legs barely responding. I expected at any moment to feel hands or claws grab me from behind, but somehow I reached the snow-covered ground and collapsed. The sound that saved my life was an engine. An ATV engine, specifically, belonging to a ministry ranger named Douglas Brennan, who'd been patrolling the shoreline access roads. He'd seen my flare and come to investigate, arriving just as I collapsed in the snow, shaking so violently I couldn't speak. Doug acted with the competence of someone who'd dealt with winter emergencies before. He wrapped me in thermal blankets from his emergency kit, loaded me onto the ATV, and drove directly to the ranger station 3 miles away. I tried to tell him something was chasing me, tried to warn him about the thing on the ice, but my words came out as incomprehensible mumbles through chattering teeth. At the station, they stripped off my frozen clothes, wrapped me in heated blankets, and poured hot, sweet tea down my throat while monitoring me for hypothermia. My core temperature had dropped to 94 degrees, low enough to be dangerous but not immediately life-threatening. They wanted to airlift me to the hospital in Kenora, but I refused, insisting I just needed to warm up. It took 6 hours before I stopped shaking. Another 2 before I could speak coherently. I told Doug everything. The footprints circling my shack. The destroyed structure at Byron's place. The figure watching from the trees. The pursuit across the ice. He listened without interrupting, his expression carefully neutral. "You're not the first," he finally said, voice quiet. That simple statement chilled me more than the ice water had. He explained, reluctantly, that every few years they received reports from the Devil's Elbow area. Fishermen finding strange tracks. Equipment destroyed for no apparent reason. Occasionally someone would go missing, leaving only abandoned gear and bloodstains on the ice. The official reports always blamed animal attacks or harsh weather. But Doug had worked this territory for 18 years, and he'd seen too many of these incidents to believe the official explanations. "We can't put unidentified creature in the reports," he said. "People would think we were crazy. And honestly, maybe we are. But I believe you, Graham. I've seen some of those prints myself." 2 days later, after I'd recovered enough to move without discomfort, Doug drove me back to the site. The ice had refrozen overnight, and fresh snow had covered much of the evidence. But we found the hole where my snowmobile had gone through, now frozen over again with a thin layer of new ice. My machine was visible beneath, already collecting silt, a complete loss. We also found marks near the hole, deep gouges in the ice, long scratches that looked almost like claw marks, radiating away from the break. They were spaced impossibly far apart, and they dug deeper into the ice than any animal I could name. Doug photographed everything, took detailed notes, collected ice samples from around the gouges. Then he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This documentation will go into the file," he said. "But I'm telling you now, Graham, it won't change anything. The official report will list this as an animal encounter. Probably wolf or bear, despite the fact that neither explanation makes sense. The higher-ups don't want questions. They don't want tourists scared away. They definitely don't want media attention." "What about my snowmobile?" I asked. "What about Byron's shack?" "Your snowmobile went through thin ice. You got careless. Byron's shack was destroyed by weather and scavengers. That's what the reports will say." I wanted to argue, to demand they investigate properly, to force someone to acknowledge what I'd experienced. But looking at Doug's tired eyes, I understood the futility. This wasn't the first time he'd had this conversation. It wouldn't be the last. I sold my ice fishing equipment within the month. The portable shack, my augers, my rods and tip-ups. Everything went to a dealer in Thunder Bay who asked no questions about why I was liquidating gear I'd used for 4 decades. The money didn't matter. I just needed it all gone. Needed to sever every connection to that frozen nightmare. I moved south in March, settling in a small town near Lake Superior, far enough from Lake of the Woods that I wouldn't be tempted to return, close enough to water that I didn't feel completely unmoored. I took up woodworking, filled my days with the sounds of saws and sanders, anything to occupy my mind. But nights remain difficult. When I close my eyes, I see that figure loping across the ice with its impossible stride. I hear that howl that wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human. I feel the shock of frigid water closing over me, and the certainty that I was about to be dragged down into darkness. I tried once to tell my story to someone official. I called the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and spoke with a records officer named Susan Perry. She listened politely, asked several questions, and said she'd file a supplemental report. 3 weeks later, when I called back to follow up, they had no record of my call, no file, no report. Susan Perry, they told me, hadn't worked for the ministry in over 2 years. Now I'm 70 years old, and most nights I sit in my small workshop carving useless shapes from wood, trying not to think about what's still out there on the ice. But every winter I hear stories, whispered conversations at the hardware store, news articles buried on page 6 of regional papers, fishermen going missing near Devil's Elbow, their gear found abandoned on solid ice, sometimes with equipment destroyed, always with strange tracks nearby. The official reports blame weather, animals, misadventure. But I know better. I survived something that others didn't, and the guilt of that survival weighs on me every day. I should have warned people more forcefully, should have made them listen, should have done something. Catherine used to tell me I couldn't control everything, couldn't protect everyone. She was right, of course. She usually was. But late at night, when I hear ice cracking in my memory and feel phantom cold water soaking through my clothes, I wonder if she'd understand why I'm still so haunted. Because whatever walks the ice at Devil's Elbow isn't finished. It's still out there, still circling in the darkness, still leaving tracks that appear and disappear like questions without answers. And every winter it waits for the next person who seeks solitude in the frozen wilderness, seeking something else entirely, prey that will never be found, except in the disturbing reports that get filed away and forgotten. I keep a map on my workshop wall marked with every incident I've been able to confirm over the past 5 years. 37 cases. 37 people who encountered something unexplainable on that frozen expanse. Most survived. Some didn't. And Doug Brennan, who sent me the information despite regulations forbidding it, included a note with the last batch of reports. It's getting worse, Graham. More frequent. More aggressive. I don't know if it's always been this way and we're just finally paying attention, or if something's changed. But people should know. People should be warned. So I'm writing this account, documenting everything that happened during those 3 terrible days in January 21 years ago. I don't expect anyone to believe it. I don't expect it to change anything. But perhaps, somewhere, someone planning a solitary ice fishing trip will read these words and make a different choice. Perhaps they'll stay closer to civilization, fish in more populated areas, avoid the isolated chains of islands where silence waits with hungry patience. Or perhaps they'll dismiss this as the ramblings of a traumatized old man who saw nothing more than his own fear reflected in wind and ice. That's fine too. Disbelief is safer than knowledge when it comes to what lurks in the frozen wilderness. I just know that I'll never return to Lake of the Woods. I'll never again drill a hole in the ice and sit in comfortable solitude, listening to the wind. The price of that peace is too high, and I've already paid more than I can afford. But sometimes, on particularly cold winter nights, I stand at my window looking north toward where the lake lies waiting in darkness, and I wonder if it remembers me. If it's still looking. If somewhere in that vast frozen expanse, tracks are appearing in the snow, circling and circling, searching for the one who got away. I hope to God that I never find out. My name is Rufus Hennessy, and the events I'm about to recount occurred in 2011. At the time, I was employed as a police officer in Fairview, Nebraska, a small town where I was born and raised. Fairview is the quintessential American small town, where everyone knows their neighbors and the community spirit is strong. Prior to the incident I'm about to describe, I believed I had seen everything there was to see in our quiet corner of the world. However, one night changed my perspective entirely, altering the course of my life and the fabric of our community. I had been serving on the Fairview Police Force for approximately 15 years, having joined immediately after graduating high school. The decision to forego college and pursue a career in law enforcement was driven by my desire to make a tangible difference in my community. There was a certain comfort in the routine of small-town policing, the predictability of Mrs. Barlow's monthly calls about her missing cat, or Mr. Jenkins' attempts to pilfer a bottle of whiskey from the general store, more out of boredom than malice. On the night in question, I was stationed at the police department, working through a stack of paperwork and nursing my third cup of subpar coffee. The clock on the wall read 11 p.m., and the quiet of the night was broken only by the occasional crackle of the police radio and the hum of the ancient air conditioning unit. Suddenly, the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the silence. I answered promptly, recognizing the voice of Millie, our dispatcher. Her tone immediately put me on alert. Millie was typically unflappable, but now her voice trembled with barely contained panic. "Rufus, you need to get over to the old Miller place," she said, her words rushed and breathless. "What's the situation, Millie?" I inquired, already reaching for my jacket and car keys. "Just get over there, Rufus. It's bad," she replied cryptically before abruptly ending the call. The Miller property had been abandoned for several years following the death of its owner. The deceased children had shown no interest in maintaining or selling the property, leaving it to fall into disrepair. Over time, it had become a popular spot for local teenagers to test their bravery, daring each other to spend the night in the decaying farmhouse. As I drove through the quiet streets of Fairview, my mind raced with possibilities. Millie's uncharacteristic behavior suggested that this was no ordinary call. The knot of apprehension in my stomach tightened as I approached the outskirts of town where the Miller property was located. Turning onto the long, overgrown driveway, I immediately noticed something amiss. Despite the property's abandoned status, there were lights visible through the grimy windows of the farmhouse. The flickering quality of the illumination suggested candles or flashlights rather than functioning electricity. I brought my cruiser to a stop and radioed in my location to dispatch. As I exited the vehicle, the cool night air carried the scent of decaying wood and damp earth. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my boots as I approached the house. Drawing my flashlight and sidearm, I cautiously made my way to the front porch. The wooden steps creaked ominously under my weight, and I noticed that the front door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the night breeze. "Hello?" I called out, pushing the door open further with my foot. "This is the police. Is anyone here?" My voice echoed through the empty house, met only by silence. Steeling myself, I crossed the threshold, the floorboards groaning in protest. The flickering light I had observed from outside seemed to be emanating from the living room. As I turned the corner, the beam of my flashlight illuminated a scene that would haunt me for years to come. In the center of the room stood a makeshift altar, surrounded by candles whose flames cast eerie dancing shadows on the walls. Atop the altar lay a sight that turned my blood to ice. The body of a young woman, bound and gagged, her lifeless eyes staring vacantly at the ceiling. As I approached, my training kicking in despite the horror of the situation. I checked for a pulse, knowing even as I did so that it was futile. The woman's skin was cool to the touch, indicating that she had been dead for some time. With shaking hands, I reached for my radio. "Millie, I need backup at the Miller place, now, and send an ambulance." I fought to keep my voice steady as I relayed the grim discovery. As I waited for backup to arrive, a sound from upstairs caught my attention. It was a subtle noise, barely perceptible, the sound of movement, of someone trying to remain undetected. Every instinct told me to wait for assistance, but a combination of duty and a burning need to understand what had transpired in this house propelled me towards the staircase. With my heart pounding in my chest and my weapon at the ready, I began to ascend the stairs, each step bringing me closer to a confrontation that would change my life forever. The second floor of the Miller house was in even worse condition than the first. Years of neglect had taken their toll, with peeling wallpaper and warped floorboards creating an atmosphere of decay and abandonment. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing closed doors lining a narrow hallway. The shuffling sound I had heard from downstairs was more pronounced now, emanating from behind one of the closed doors. I approached cautiously, my police training warring with the primal fear that threatened to overwhelm me. Positioning myself to the side of the door, I called out, "Police! Come out with your hands up." My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence of the house. For a moment there was no response. Then slowly the door began to creak open. I tightened my grip on my weapon, prepared for whatever might emerge. The figure that stepped out of the room was unlike anything I had encountered in my years of police work. It was a man, or at least it had once been a man. He stood unnaturally tall, his gaunt frame accentuated by tattered, dirty clothing. But it was his face that sent a chill down my spine. Wild, sunken eyes that seemed to glow with an inner madness, and a rictus grin that stretched his features into a grotesque mask. In his hand he clutched a long, wicked-looking knife. The blade gleamed dully in the beam of my flashlight, its edge stained with what I feared was blood. "Drop the knife," I commanded, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "Drop it now." The man's grin widened impossibly further, and a low guttural sound emerged from his throat. Not quite a laugh, not quite a growl. Then, with a speed that belied his emaciated appearance, he lunged towards me. I fired my weapon, the sound of the gunshot deafening in the confined space of the hallway. The man staggered, the knife clattering to the floor, before he crumpled in a heap at my feet. My heart pounding, I approached cautiously, kicking the knife away before checking for a pulse. There was none. The man was dead. As the adrenaline began to subside, I became aware of the sound of sirens in the distance. Backup was finally arriving. I made my way back downstairs, my mind reeling from the events of the past few minutes. The house was soon swarming with officers and crime scene technicians. The body of the young woman was carefully removed from the makeshift altar, and a thorough search of the premises began. As the senior officer on the scene, I oversaw the initial investigation. The woman was identified as Emily Larkin, a 22-year-old student at the local community college, who had been reported missing 2 days prior. The man I had shot was identified through fingerprints as David Halstead, a drifter with a history of mental illness and minor criminal offenses. As we combed through the house, more disturbing details emerged. In what appeared to be Halstead's living space, we discovered journals filled with rambling entries about dark rituals and sacrifices. The writings were barely coherent, filled with references to ancient gods and promises of power through bloodshed. Evidence suggested that Halstead had been squatting in the abandoned house for several weeks, possibly months. The room where I had encountered him was filled with occult paraphernalia. Strange symbols drawn on the walls, crystals and bones arranged in patterns that made no sense to my rational mind. As dawn broke over Fairview, casting a pale light over the crime scene, I found myself standing on the front porch of the Miller house, trying to make sense of what had transpired. The events of the night had shaken me to my core, forcing me to confront the reality that evil could manifest even in the most unexpected places. Little did I know that this was only the beginning. The horror that had unfolded in the Miller house would cast a long shadow over our town, changing the fabric of our community and testing the limits of our resilience in ways we could never have imagined. The days following the gruesome discovery at the Miller house were a whirlwind of activity. Fairview, typically a town where the biggest news was the outcome of the high school football game, suddenly found itself thrust into the national spotlight. News vans from larger cities descended upon us, their satellite dishes and eager reporters an alien presence in our quiet streets. The story of Emily Larkin's murder and the subsequent confrontation with David Halstead spread quickly, first through local channels and then picked up by national media outlets. Our small police force was overwhelmed with inquiries from journalists and concerned citizens alike. As the lead officer on the case, much of the responsibility fell on my shoulders. I spent countless hours coordinating with state investigators, fielding questions from reporters, and trying to piece together the events that had led to this tragedy. The autopsy report on Emily Larkin painted a grim picture. She had been held captive for at least 36 hours before her death, subjected to torture and ritualistic markings. The cause of death was determined to be blood loss from multiple knife wounds, each carefully placed in a pattern that corresponded to the ramblings in Halstead's journals. The investigation into David Halstead's background revealed a troubled history. He had been in and out of mental health facilities for years, diagnosed with severe schizophrenia and delusional disorder. Somewhere along the line, he had fallen through the cracks of the system, his deteriorating mental state going unchecked as he drifted from town to town. As we delved deeper into Halstead's past, we discovered connections to various fringe groups and online forums dedicated to occult practices. It seemed that in his delusional state, he had cobbled together a belief system from bits and pieces of different mythologies and conspiracy theories, creating a twisted worldview that justified his horrific actions. The impact on our community was profound. Fairview had always prided itself on being a safe place, where people left their doors unlocked and children played freely in the streets. Now, an undercurrent of fear ran through the town. Parents kept a closer eye on their children, and neighbors viewed strangers with suspicion. The Larkin family was devastated. Emily had been well liked in the community, known for her kind heart and volunteer work at the local animal shelter. The memorial service held for her was attended by nearly the entire town, a somber affair that underscored the collective grief and shock we all felt. As for me, the events of that night had left an indelible mark. I found myself plagued by nightmares, reliving the moment I confronted Halstead, seeing Emily's lifeless eyes staring accusingly at me. During my waking hours, I was consumed by a sense of guilt. If only I had gotten there sooner. If only we had taken the missing persons report more seriously from the start, maybe Emily would still be alive. Chief Anderson, recognizing the toll the case had taken on me, suggested I take some time off, but I couldn't bring myself to step away. I threw myself into work with renewed vigor, determined to ensure that nothing like this would ever happen in Fairview again. We implemented new protocols for missing persons cases, increased patrols around abandoned properties, and worked to establish better communication channels with mental health services in neighboring counties. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start. As the weeks passed and the media attention began to wane, Fairview slowly tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the scars remained, visible in the wary glances of passers-by and the new security systems being installed on homes throughout the town. One evening, as I was leaving the station after another long day, I found myself driving past the Miller property. The house stood dark and silent, crime scene tape still fluttering in the breeze. In that moment, I made a decision. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could work to prevent it from happening again. I would dedicate myself to protecting Fairview, to being the guardian our town needed in these dark times. Little did I know that this commitment would be tested sooner than I could have imagined, as the echoes of Halstead's madness continued to reverberate through our community. In the months following the tragedy at the Miller house, Fairview struggled to regain its footing. The initial shock had worn off, but a pervasive sense of unease lingered in the air. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the potential for darkness that had always existed beneath the surface of our idyllic small-town life. As summer turned to fall, strange occurrences began to plague the town. It started small. Reports of vandalism at the local cemetery, strange symbols carved into trees at the edge of town, whispers of shadowy figures seen lurking near abandoned buildings at night. At first, we dismissed these incidents as the work of pranksters or overactive imaginations fueled by the recent tragedy. But as Halloween approached, things took a more sinister turn. A group of teenagers, inspired by the morbid fascination surrounding the Miller house, decided to break in for a night of ghost hunting. What they found inside sent them running in terror. Fresh candles arranged in bizarre patterns, and walls newly adorned with the same type of symbols found in Halstead's journals. When I arrived at the scene, my blood ran cold. The symbols were an exact match to those we had documented months ago, drawn with the same frenzied precision. But David Halstead was dead. I had seen to that myself, which meant that someone else was continuing his work. A thorough search of the property revealed no physical evidence of an intruder, but the implications were clear.
Halstead's madness had spread beyond his death, infecting others with its toxic ideology.
As news of this development spread through town, the fear that had begun to subside reignited with a vengeance. Parents kept their children home from school, businesses closed early, and a self-imposed curfew fell over Fairview. The carefree spirit that had once defined our community was replaced by a cloud of suspicion and paranoia. In response to the growing crisis, I called a town meeting at the community center. The large hall was packed to capacity, filled with concerned citizens looking for answers and reassurance. As I stood at the podium, facing the sea of worried faces, I felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. "I know you're all scared," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. What happened to Emily Larkin was a tragedy, one that shook us all to our core. And now, with these new incidents, it's natural to feel afraid. But we cannot let fear control us. We cannot let the actions of one disturbed individual, or those who might seek to emulate him, destroy the community we've built together. I outlined the steps we were taking to increase security and investigate the recent occurrences. I emphasized the importance of community vigilance, urging people to report any suspicious activity without falling into the trap of baseless accusations or hysteria. As the meeting concluded, I could sense a shift in the atmosphere. There was still fear, yes, but also a renewed sense of determination. Fairview had been knocked down, but we were not out. We would face this threat together, as a community. In the weeks that followed, we saw an increase in neighborhood watch participation and a stronger sense of cooperation between the police force and the citizens we served. People began to look out for one another more actively, checking in on elderly neighbors and organizing community events to maintain a sense of normalcy. But even as Fairview rallied, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial. The incidents at the Miller house felt like more than just copycat actions or misguided pranks. There was a deliberateness to them, a purpose that eluded my understanding. Late one night, as I pored over the case files for the 100th time, a detail caught my eye. In one of Halstead's journals, he had made repeated references to a circle and chosen ones who would carry on his work. At the time, we had dismissed it as the ramblings of a deranged mind. But now, in light of recent events, I began to wonder if there was more to... As I delved deeper into Halstead's writings, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. His references to a circle and chosen ones were more frequent and detailed than we had initially realized. It appeared that Halstead believed he was part of a larger group, tasked with preparing for some sort of apocalyptic event. This revelation cast the recent incidents in a new light. If Halstead had indeed been part of a larger organization, it was possible that other members were continuing his work. The implications were chilling. We might be dealing with a coordinated group rather than isolated copycats. I shared my findings with Chief Anderson, who agreed that this new information warranted a deeper investigation. We decided to reach out to the state police and the FBI for assistance, recognizing that this situation might be beyond the capabilities of our small-town force. As we waited for additional resources to arrive, we increased patrols around town, paying special attention to abandoned properties and areas where the strange symbols had been found. The citizens of Fairview, while still on edge, rallied to support these efforts. Neighborhood watch groups coordinated with our officers, providing extra eyes and ears on the ground. Despite these precautions, the unsettling incidents continued. More symbols appeared around town, always in locations that were difficult to monitor. Anonymous tips began to come in, speaking of shadowy gatherings in the woods outside of town. Each new development added to the growing sense of unease that permeated Fairview. With the arrival of state police and FBI resources, our investigation took on a new level of intensity. Agents combed through Halstead's personal effects, analyzed his online activities, and began to piece together a network of contacts that stretched far beyond the borders of our small town. As the lead local officer on the case, I found myself working closely with FBI agent Sarah Reeves. Agent Reeves was a no-nonsense professional with a background in cult activity and fringe religious groups. Her expertise proved invaluable as we delved deeper into the twisted ideology that had driven Halstead. Based on what we've uncovered, Agent Reeves explained during one of our briefings, it appears that Halstead was involved with a loosely organized group that calls itself the Circle of the Eternal Night. They believe in hastening the arrival of some sort of cosmic entity through ritual sacrifice and the creation of what they call nodes of power. The more we learned about this group, the more concerned I became. It seemed that the Miller House incident, as horrific as it was, might have been just the beginning of their plans for Fairview. Our breakthrough came when we managed to identify one of Halstead's online contacts, a local man named Michael Thornton. Thornton had a history of mental health issues and had been in and out of treatment facilities over the years. More importantly, he had been seen in the vicinity of several locations where the strange symbols had appeared. We obtained a warrant to search Thornton's residence. It's a small apartment on the outskirts of town. What we found there confirmed our worst fears. The walls were covered in the same symbols we had found at the Miller House, and we discovered journals that mirrored Halstead's writings in their fervor and delusion. But Thornton himself was nowhere to be found. It appeared he had fled shortly before our arrival, tipped off perhaps by some unknown source. This development added a new urgency to our investigation. We now had a name and a face to pursue, but also the knowledge that our quarry was aware of our interest. As we expanded our search for Thornton, we also focused on identifying other potential members of the Circle. This proved to be a challenging task, as the group operated with a high degree of secrecy and paranoia. However, bit by bit, we began to uncover a network that stretched throughout the region, with Fairview as its epicenter. The citizens of Fairview, already on edge from the previous incidents, reacted to these new developments with a mixture of fear and determination. Many volunteered to assist in the search for Thornton, while others worked to support the law enforcement efforts in any way they could. As the investigation progressed, I found myself working long hours, often late into the night. The case had become more than just a professional obligation. It was personal. I felt a deep responsibility to the people of Fairview, a need to protect them from the darkness that threatened to engulf our town. Little did I know that our efforts were about to come to a head in a confrontation that would test the limits of our resolve and forever change the face of Fairview. Our search for Michael Thornton and other members of the Circle of the Eternal Night came to a dramatic climax on a cold November night. An anonymous tip led us to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, where a gathering of the group was supposedly taking place. As we approached the location, the tension was palpable. A joint task force of local police, state troopers, and FBI agents had been assembled for the operation. The warehouse loomed before us, a hulking silhouette against the night sky. Agent Reeves and I led one of the entry teams. As we breached the main entrance, the scene that greeted us was like something out of a nightmare. The interior of the warehouse had been transformed into a macabre temple, with strange symbols covering the walls and floor. Candles flickered in intricate patterns, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. In the center of this grotesque display stood Michael Thornton, surrounded by a group of robed figures. They were in the midst of some sort of ritual, their chanting rising to a fever pitch as we entered. "FBI, everybody freeze," Agent Reeves shouted, her voice cutting through the chanting. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. Then, chaos erupted. Some of the cultists attempted to flee, while others, including Thornton, turned to confront us. The ensuing struggle was intense but mercifully brief. Our superior numbers and training quickly overwhelmed the cultists. As the dust settled and we began to process the scene, the true scope of what we had uncovered became clear. Documents found at the site revealed plans for a series of ritual killings, intended to create a network of power nodes throughout the region. Fairview, it seemed, was to be the epicenter of this dark design. The interrogations that followed painted a picture of a group driven by a mixture of mental illness, desperation, and a twisted ideology that promised power and purpose to its adherents. Many of the cultists were local residents, people I had known for years. The realization that this darkness had taken root so close to home was deeply unsettling. In the days following the raid, Fairview was once again thrust into the national spotlight. The exposure of a cult operating in the heart of small-town America captured the public imagination, bringing a fresh wave of media attention and curiosity seekers to our community. The aftermath of the cult's exposure and the subsequent arrests left Fairview reeling. The knowledge that friends and neighbors had been involved in such dark activities shook the foundations of trust within the community. People looked at each other with new eyes, wondering who else might be hiding terrible secrets. As the legal proceedings began, I found myself spending long hours testifying and assisting in the prosecution of the cult members. The trials were a grueling process, forcing us to relive the horrors we had uncovered and confront the human cost of the cult's activities. Throughout this period, I struggled with my own feelings of guilt and responsibility. Could I have done more to prevent this? Should I have seen the signs earlier? These questions haunted me, even as I worked to help the community heal. The recovery process for Fairview was slow and painful. Support groups were formed for those affected by the cult's activities, including family members of the arrested cultists. The town held numerous community meetings and events aimed at rebuilding trust and a sense of security. As the months passed, I noticed a gradual shift in the town's atmosphere. The initial fear and suspicion began to give way to a renewed sense of community spirit. People seemed more aware of their neighbors, more willing to reach out and offer support to those in need. 5 years have passed since the events that shook Fairview to its core. In that time, our town has undergone a profound transformation. The scars remain, but they have become a part of our shared history, a reminder of the darkness we faced and overcame together. I have since been promoted to Chief of Police, a position that allows me to continue working to protect and serve the community I love. The experiences we went through have shaped my approach to law enforcement, emphasizing the importance of community engagement and mental health awareness. Fairview itself has become something of a case study in community resilience. Researchers and law enforcement professionals from around the country have visited to learn from our experiences and the measures we've put in place to prevent similar incidents in the future. As I reflect on the events of that fateful year, I am struck by the complexity of human nature, its capacity for both great evil and tremendous good. The cult members, driven by delusion and desperation, caused immeasurable harm. But the response of the community, the way people came together to support one another and rebuild, revealed the inherent strength and goodness that exists within us all. The Miller House, once a symbol of the terror that gripped our town, has been demolished. In its place stands a community garden, a place of growth and renewal. It serves as a fitting metaphor for Fairview itself. From the ashes of tragedy, we have cultivated new life and hope. As I walk the streets of Fairview today, I see a town forever changed but not defeated. We carry the memory of those dark days with us, but we do not let it define us. Instead, we have chosen to learn from our past and use that knowledge to build a stronger, more compassionate community. The events of 2011 taught us that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, but they also showed us the power of unity and resilience. As long as we remain vigilant, support one another, and face our challenges together, I believe that Fairview, and communities like it across the country, can withstand whatever darkness may come. In the end, this is not just a story about a crime or a cult. It's a story about a town that looked into the abyss and emerged stronger for it. It's a testament to the enduring spirit of community and the fundamental goodness that exists within us all. And it's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there is always hope for a brighter tomorrow. The Arizona Strip has always held a special place in my heart. It's a remote, isolated stretch of wilderness north of the Grand Canyon, an area known for massive mule deer and unforgiving country. My hunting partner Jason and I had been pursuing game together since our high school days back in 2015, and by now we weren't exactly green. We'd spent nearly 8 weeks planning this particular hunt after securing written permission to pursue deer near Mount Trumbull in the Kaibab National Forest. A mutual acquaintance had mentioned an old ranger station we could use as base camp, and the opportunity seemed perfect. Free shelter in prime mule deer territory felt like a gift we couldn't refuse. The road from Cedar City down to the Strip was punishing and rough, but my Tacoma had been purchased specifically for this kind of abuse. We departed before sunrise, topped off the fuel tank, and made our way through Hurricane and Colorado City before transitioning onto the dirt roads leading into Kaibab National Forest. The deeper we pushed into the wilderness, the more isolated everything became. No settlements, no homesteads, just endless expanses of juniper, sagebrush, and crimson dirt stretching toward every horizon. Jace monitored the coordinates on his handheld GPS unit and eventually gestured down a faded two-track disappearing deeper into the tree line. "This should be it," he announced, and we continued bouncing along for another 20 minutes before the structure came into view. A squat, deteriorating building sat tucked between the junipers. The shack appeared forgotten by time itself, constructed from rough-hewn logs with a corrugated metal roof that bore the scars of rust and countless dents. A stovepipe protruded crookedly from the top, listing slightly to one side. "Looks inviting," Jay said with obvious sarcasm as we rolled to a stop. I laughed and grabbed my pack from the bed. The building was perhaps 15 feet square, with a single door and two small windows. One of the windows had been covered with weathered boards, nailed from the interior. The whole structure leaned slightly, as if the ground beneath it had shifted over decades of freeze and thaw cycles. Inside, the air carried the thick scent of must and abandonment. Dust particles danced lazily in beams of dying sunlight that penetrated through gaps in the log walls. A broken cot frame occupied one corner, its canvas long since rotted away. An ancient wood-burning stove sat in another corner, its cast-iron surface covered in a thick layer of ash and grime. In the middle of the room stood a small wooden table with two mismatched chairs, one missing its back support entirely. It wasn't the Ritz, but it beat sleeping on the ground in a tent. "Check this out," Jay said, moving toward the far window. I joined him and immediately noticed something odd about the boards covering the broken pane. The edges were darkened and charred, as if they'd been exposed to intense heat at some point. "Probably just someone being careless and starting a fire in here," I offered, though the explanation felt thin even as I said it. "Yeah, but why board it up from the inside?" Jace asked, frowning. He looked uncomfortable for a moment, then seemed to shake off whatever thought had crossed his mind. "Whatever. Let's get some rest. We're glassing for deer at first light." We prepared a quick meal on our portable propane stove, the aroma of canned beef stew gradually filling the cramped space. Darkness descended quickly outside, and with it came a profound, unsettling silence. Normally, we'd hear coyotes yipping in the distance, or at least the chirping of crickets and other insects. Tonight the forest felt completely empty, as if every living thing had evacuated the area. After eating, we unrolled our sleeping bags on the dusty floor and settled in for the night. I kept my rifle within arm's reach, a habit formed over years of hunting in remote areas where bears and mountain lions sometimes wandered into camp. I have no clear sense of how long I'd been asleep when something yanked me violently back to consciousness. A heavy, solid impact resonated through the roof above us. My heart immediately began hammering against my ribcage, adrenaline flooding my system like ice water in my veins. Beside me, I heard Jace stirring, his voice emerging as a harsh whisper in the darkness. "You hear that?" "Yeah," I whispered back, my mouth suddenly dry. Probably a mountain lion jumping onto the roof. We sat motionless, rifles now in our hands, safeties off. Another impact came, harder and heavier than the first, followed by complete silence. My pulse thundered in my ears as I strained to detect any sound from outside. The quiet stretched out painfully, and I had just begun to relax my grip on the rifle when a different sound filled the shack. A slow, deliberate scratching against the front door. It wasn't frantic, like an animal desperately trying to gain entry. The sound was measured, careful, almost thoughtful. Each scratch seemed to be testing the wood, exploring the door's surface with methodical precision. I glanced over at Jace. Even in the darkness, I could see his eyes were wide, reflecting what little starlight penetrated through the cracks in the walls. "Mountain lion," he mouthed silently. I shook my head slowly. Lions didn't behave this way. They didn't calmly scratch at doors like they were trying to solve a puzzle. This was something else entirely, though I couldn't imagine what. I shifted my position, inching toward the door with my rifle raised. Every muscle in my body felt coiled tight, ready to react to whatever emerged from the darkness. My finger rested alongside the trigger guard, not quite on the trigger itself, but close enough to respond instantly. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the scratching stopped. We waited in the suffocating silence, barely drawing breath, ears straining to detect any hint of movement outside. Minutes crawled by like hours. Finally, unable to tolerate the tension any longer, I reached for the door and cracked it open slowly, pointing both my flashlight and rifle barrel into the blackness beyond. Nothing. No tracks in the dirt. No eyeshine reflecting back from the beam. Nothing except empty darkness extending endlessly into the surrounding trees. The forest stood perfectly still, eerily quiet and devoid of any life whatsoever. I eased the door shut again, my hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline still coursing through my system. I dragged the old wooden chair across the floor and wedged it under the door handle, knowing full well it would provide minimal security against any determined threat, but needing to do something, anything, to feel less vulnerable. Jace said nothing, but the questions in his eyes were clear enough. What was out there? Why had it approached our shelter? And most disturbing of all, why had it stopped? Neither of us managed to sleep again that night. We sat in the darkness, backs against the log walls, rifles across our laps, watching the door and counting down the interminable hours until dawn would finally break through the cracks in the walls. My legs grew numb from sitting in the same position, but I didn't dare move. Every small sound, every creaking board in the old structure, sent fresh jolts of anxiety through my nervous system. When morning finally arrived, the first pale gray light filtering through gaps in the logs felt like a reprieve. We stepped outside cautiously, weapons ready, and began a careful examination of the area surrounding the shack. I walked in a wide circle around the structure, scanning the ground meticulously for paw prints, claw marks, or any disturbance in the dirt that might explain what had visited us during the night. Jace accompanied me, his rifle slung loosely over his shoulder now that daylight had returned, but his attention remained focused on the ground. We searched for nearly 30 minutes, covering every approach to the shack. But there was nothing. No disturbed earth, no scratches in the dirt, no prints of any kind. The ground around the shack appeared completely undisturbed, as if nothing had approached the building in weeks or months. Maybe we both imagined it, Jace suggested half-heartedly, kicking at a dry juniper branch lying in the dirt. You and I both know we didn't, I replied quietly, my voice carrying an edge of frustration. Something was up there on that roof. Something heavy enough to make the whole structure shake. We decided to conduct a more thorough inspection of the shack's interior in the daylight. Everything appeared exactly as we'd left it the night before. The sleeping bags lay crumpled on the floor. Our cooking gear sat stacked near the propane stove. Our packs leaned against the wall. I approached the boarded-up window again, the same one we'd noticed upon arrival. Something caught my attention, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Jace, come look at this. He crossed the room and followed my gaze. Along the inner window ledge, beneath the charred boards, 3 deep scratches had been carved vertically into the wood. These weren't thin surface marks or shallow grooves. They had been gouged deeply into the timber, clearly fresh, with splinters still curled upward along the edges. What in God's name? Jace muttered, his voice suddenly quiet and strained. How is that even possible? I asked, though I already knew he had no answer. Those boards haven't moved. They're still nailed solidly in place. He was right. The boards remained firmly attached to the window frame, exactly as we'd found them yesterday. Yet here we stood, staring at 3 claw marks too large and too deep to belong to any mountain lion or bear I'd ever encountered. The scratches appeared fresh, the wood still light-colored where it had been torn away. I don't like this at all, Jace said flatly, stepping back from the window. We'll hunt today, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even though I could hear it wavering slightly. But maybe we should leave tonight. I don't want to experience another night like that. Jace nodded slowly, and I could see relief in his expression. We spent the day hiking a nearby ridge, using our binoculars to glass for mule deer in the valleys below. The sun shone brightly overhead, but a strange stillness continued to hang over the forest like an invisible blanket. No birds called out from the branches. No squirrels scrambled through the junipers. No insects buzzed around our heads. Just silence and empty air. It felt profoundly unnatural, oppressive in a way I'd never experienced in decades of hunting. The wilderness should be alive with sound and movement, especially during the day when animals are most active. Instead, the entire forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. We saw nothing move the entire day. No deer, no elk, Not even a rabbit or a chipmunk. The whole forest appeared completely devoid of life, as if every creature had fled from some unseen threat. The day passed with uncomfortable silence between us. Both of us felt unsettled and weary, jumping at every cracking twig or rustling leaf, though most of those sounds turned out to be caused by our own movements. By the time evening approached, neither of us mentioned staying another night. The decision had been made silently, mutually understood. We returned to the shack and packed our gear quickly, loading most of it into the Tacoma. We were determined to depart before darkness returned and brought with it whatever had visited us the previous night. But as the sun dropped behind the horizon, the shadows seemed to grow unnaturally dense around the shack. The temperature plummeted rapidly, which wasn't unusual for high-elevation desert country, but this cold felt different. It felt deliberate, as if something heavy and unseen had settled around us like a frozen shroud. We'd just thrown the last of our packs into the truck bed when the first heavy impact echoed from the roof again, louder and more forceful than the night before. The entire structure seemed to shudder beneath the weight. Jay spun toward me, eyes wide, face drained of color. "Let's go. Now." I didn't hesitate. We both moved swiftly toward the truck doors. But before we could reach them, a slow metallic tapping rang out from above. The sound came from the stovepipe protruding from the roof, a rhythmic scratching of something hard against the metal surface. It was deliberate, almost like a pattern, and I felt panic beginning to creep into my chest like icy fingers around my heart. Whatever was here knew exactly where we were, and it wasn't displaying any fear of us or our weapons. Instinctively, I raised my rifle and swept the flashlight beam across the tree line behind us. The pale beam bounced wildly before catching something standing partially hidden behind a twisted juniper approximately 20 yards away. My breath caught sharply in my throat. It wasn't a mountain lion. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever encountered in my entire life. The figure was tall, unnaturally lean, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. It stood upright but moved with a jerky, unsettling gait as it shifted from behind one tree to another. The skin appeared pale, almost luminescent in the flashlight beam, completely hairless. Its proportions were all wrong, like someone had taken a human form and stretched it vertically while compressing it horizontally. "Get in the truck," I whispered hoarsely, my voice barely functional. As I spoke, the thing stepped forward slightly, emerging just enough for me to see it more clearly. The arms ended in long, skeletal fingers that seemed to have too many joints. The head was elongated, tilted at an odd angle, and where eyes should have been were only dark, sunken pits that reflected nothing from my flashlight beam. Jay swung around, saw it too, and gasped sharply. "Oh God." We both backed quickly toward the truck doors, rifles raised defensively. But the figure moved again, faster this time, slipping behind another tree and disappearing into the shadows. For a long moment, the forest was utterly silent once more. Then we heard a shuffling sound, footsteps crunching through dead leaves and snapping twigs, moving along the trail behind the truck. The sounds were deliberate, methodical, as if whatever it was had decided to cut off our escape route. "It's blocking the road out," Jay said, his voice strained and trembling. "Not for long," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Get in, now." We threw ourselves into the truck. I slammed it into reverse, dirt and gravel flying as we bounced roughly backward down the trail. The headlights illuminated only the narrow track behind us, branches clawing at the windows and scraping loudly against the side panels. But we didn't stop. We didn't look back. All I could think about was escape, putting as much distance as possible between us and whatever was watching from the darkness. The truck lurched violently as we backed down the narrow, rutted trail. Branches scraped harshly against the side mirrors, producing a nails-on-chalkboard screech, and rocks thumped loudly beneath the chassis, but neither of us even considered slowing down. My heart hammered relentlessly against my ribs. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white, while Jay stared out the back window, rifle clutched in both hands, scanning the darkness behind us. "Keep going," Jace urged. "Don't stop for anything." The headlights barely illuminated the rough path, throwing distorted shadows onto the junipers and brush lining the trail. Every twisted branch looked like reaching limbs. Every shadow seemed to shift and move under our frantic movements, creating the illusion of figures darting between the trees. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, we reached a wider dirt road. I spun the wheel sharply, whipped the Tacoma around in a spray of gravel, slammed it into drive, and hit the accelerator hard. Dust billowed behind us in massive clouds as we sped toward Fredonia. Neither of us spoke for miles. We were both breathing heavily, minds racing, adrenaline still pumping through our systems. The empty highway offered little comfort. It was a long, silent ride back toward civilization. We reached Fredonia sometime around 3 in the morning. Exhausted, rattled, and running on pure adrenaline, we pulled into a gas station parking lot under harsh fluorescent lights. I killed the engine, but neither of us moved immediately. We just sat there, staring straight ahead, trying to process what we'd experienced. Finally, Jace broke the silence. What in God's name was that thing? I shook my head slowly, still gripping the steering wheel even though we'd stopped. I have absolutely no idea, but whatever it was, I never want to see it again. We spent the rest of the night in the truck, catching scattered, fitful sleep as dawn gradually crept over the horizon. When morning finally arrived, we stumbled into a diner seeking strong coffee and some sense of normalcy. We sat at a booth, pale and quiet, barely touching the food we'd ordered. An older man at the counter, wearing a worn flannel jacket and faded jeans, eyed us carefully before finally approaching our table. His weathered face carried the deep lines of someone who'd spent decades working outdoors. "You fellows look like you've seen something rough," he said, leaning on the edge of our table. "Rough doesn't begin to cover it," I muttered, exchanging a glance with Jace. "Where were you hunting?" the man asked, sipping his coffee casually. "Up near Mount Trumbull," I answered quietly. "We stayed in an old ranger station just east of there." Before I could finish, the old man's expression shifted sharply, his casual demeanor evaporating instantly. "You stayed where?" "An old ranger station," Jace repeated cautiously. "Out by Mount Trumbull. Small log building with a metal roof." The man stared at us both with a mixture of disbelief and something else I couldn't quite identify. Concern? Fear? "Boys, that station burned down years ago, back in the late 80s. Nothing left up there but a foundation and old stories. You absolutely certain you're talking about the same place?" I felt the blood drain from my face. My mouth went suddenly dry, and my throat felt tight. "No way, we stayed in it for 2 nights, slept on the floor, cooked dinner on the table inside." He shook his head slowly, his expression grim. "No, you didn't. Nobody's used that station in over 3 decades. That fire gutted it completely, and everybody local knows better than to camp near there anyway. Strange things happen in that area, always have." Jay stared at me, eyes wide, silently pleading with me to argue, to prove the old man wrong. But I had nothing to say. We'd both stood inside that structure, felt the warped floorboards beneath our boots, seen the charred boards over the window, touched the scratches in the wood. But now, doubt was creeping into my mind, twisting everything I'd believed just moments ago. Several weeks passed, but neither of us could shake the experience. The dreams came frequently, always the same. The scratching, the thing in the trees, the impossible reality of what we'd witnessed. Finally, after countless sleepless nights, we agreed to return to the station one final time. We needed closure more than answers. This time we brought Jace's cousin, a firefighter named Ben who had GPS equipment and a level head. The drive back into Kaibab was tense and silent, anxiety twisting in my stomach with every mile closer we got to Mount Trumbull. When we arrived at the coordinates, my chest tightened painfully. The structure stood exactly where we remembered, but it looked completely different now. The logs were weathered and gray, showing no signs of fire damage. The windows were perfectly intact, unbroken and unboarded. A rusted padlock secured the door, clearly undisturbed for years. The lock itself was covered in rust and dust, suggesting decades of exposure to the elements. There were no tire tracks in the hard-packed dirt, no boot prints, no sign that we'd ever been there at all. "No way," Jace whispered, stepping back uneasily. "This isn't possible." Ben walked around the structure twice, examining it carefully, shaking his head. "This place has been locked up tight for years, guy. Decades, probably. You absolutely sure you're not confusing it with somewhere else?" I didn't answer immediately. There was nothing I could say that would make sense. We both knew this was the exact location we'd fled from in terror just weeks earlier. The GPS coordinates matched perfectly. The surrounding landmarks were identical. Yet somehow, impossibly, it stood here completely sealed and undisturbed, as if we'd never set foot inside at all. We left without another word. It was the last time either Jace or I hunted in Arizona. We haven't spoken about it since that day, but I still think about it constantly. Often at night, lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, I hear those heavy thuds echoing in my memory, one after another, always 3 in a row, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere above. And sometimes, very late at night, I hear scratching on my bedroom door, measured and careful, testing the wood. Just like that night in the Arizona Strip,